So everyone, hi, good evening. I am pretty sure I know everyone, but I'm Laura Fiorvanti, and today's discussion is about the history of Napa Valley. And we're calling this a master class, of course, because I happen to be teaching and I passed my Master Sommelier diploma, for those of you that don't know, in 2009. Just an update for all of you, especially those I haven't seen in a while, like Maniec. I am currently studying for my Master of Wine diploma. So I'm hoping that in the next couple of years, I can achieve that title as well. And so maybe we'll be the first female in the world to have both titles. So it's a very interesting time. I'm doing a lot of wine writing and a lot of studying and tastings. So once we get back to New York, we're moving back in November. Hopefully we'll start some Master of Wine tasting groups. It's a little bit of a different course of study. There's a lot more writing. And so hopefully you'll see our wine classes support that new style of learning. So back to Napa Valley. If you have yet to do so already, I highly recommend you open any Napa Valley wine. Maybe Maniec, you're on 7:30 a.m. You don't need to open some Napa Valley Cab or Chardonnay, but perhaps maybe some champagne would be good in the morning. Either way, if you're drinking something that you want to talk about or share via the chat, say so. So today we're talking about a lot about history. I think history of Napa Valley is the most fascinating, and we often think about Napa Valley and what's going on today in the last maybe 30 or 40 years, starting with the Judgment of Paris in 1976, when Napa Valley really came on the scene as far as a fine wine producing region. But really it dates back to 1821. And there's a lot of starts and stops in the American wine industry in general. Of course, you know, we are very well aware about Prohibition, but not just Prohibition, but the Great Depression and both world wars. And the arrival of phylloxera really hurt the American wine industry. And of course, the icon of the American wine industry being Napa Valley. But there's a lot to be hopeful about. I think this wine region is amongst the world-class wine regions of the world, which is to say both current vintages of Napa Valley and wines dating back, 3-4 decades are wines that we should really start to drink more. And I myself feel that there's nothing better than aged Napa Valley Cab. Actually, there's no other wine region that quite sort of shows the way Napa Valley with age does. And so if you see, wine from the 70s or 80s and you happen to be able to buy it, I highly recommend it. So we'll talk about geology. There's a number of different soils, 3 main types, and the climate, which in Napa Valley has said to be, it's always beautiful, it's always sunny. There's no vintage variation with Napa Valley. These are some of the topics that people will say, but that's not really true anymore. I think, especially with world affairs and with fires, with drought, and of course with earthquakes and things like that, it really is important to know the current vintages and how the climate change has really started to affect places, especially in our country like the Napa Valley. There's 16 different subregions, and some of the subregions are familiar. There's a couple of new ones, and they're really important when you think about the subregions and the history of the region, but also when you're visiting. I think we think sometimes, oh, Napa Valley, I'll go from Carneros to Calistoga in a day's trip. But being that there's really one road or one main road that takes you through the valley, there's 2 technically, but it can take you anywhere from 45 minutes to get from one region to the next, all the way up to, if you're driving in mountains, 3 or 4 hours. And so we'll talk about how to best plan a trip to the valley. And of course, we'll talk about those great vintages in the last, decade. If you haven't already, I recommend reading the history of Napa Valley. It's not really a read. so much as referencing the history of Napa Valley Here and Now, which is a book by Kelly White. I know Mayang, you got to meet Kelly. She's one of my best friends, and she really wrote this book that is the table that my computer is sitting on right now. And so such a big book full of a wealth of information that I referenced it today, of course, as I was looking for further detail on some of the history. So with that, let's see what, okay, yeah, Carignan is great to drink, Susan, and I myself am drinking the wines that we send from Ledoux, so I'll go ahead and tell you about that. For those of you that don't know, this is my wedding. I was married in Napa Valley in 2017, right before, or sorry, right after one of the major wildfires. And it was, of course, fitting that we show this famous sign. Everybody stops and takes pictures at this sign. So our little wedding bus stopped there. And of course, it's even more special because at that time, the first responders had made Napa Valley safe for the first time, November 4th. So we're fully in fire season at the moment, being that we're getting right towards the end of October pretty soon. And that was right around my wedding. So November 4th, those devastating fires. And we almost didn't have it. We almost had to plan a second wedding. But thankfully, as you can see from this photo, that was the wedding day, and blue skies and no smoke in sight. So the wines that we sent, if you don't already know, we have a great partnership with Ledoux. It's a fine wine and spirits wine shop in the West Village in Washington Street. And they work with us and picked some of our favorite wines to send to go along with the classes. So this is a special place. If you have yet to visit this winery, it's called Smith-Madrone. And Smith-Madrone is on Spring Mountain. So one of the mountain ranges, the northern mountain range that looks over Calistoga. And Spring Mountain is just like going back in time in the Napa Valley. It technically, the address is St. Helena when you're visiting, but it's because it's above the town of St. Helena, Calistoga. So I just put some info. If you're interested in visiting, you're going to get a copy of this presentation tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon. So you can always give them a ring, tell them that Pork Buzz sent you. It was founded in 1971. So right before the big wave of fine wine in the 70s. And it was founded by two brothers. They were grad students at University of Berkeley. And their names are Stuart and Charles Smith, and they are still the people that give you the tour when you visit. They're big, characters. We had a dinner once with Charles Smith at Pork Buzz, and really they're famous for their Riesling, which the reason I picked the two wines for this class that I did is because I feel that this is a great representation of early German settlers coming to the Napa Valley before the gold rush, and the grapes that were planted at that time were predominantly Riesling and different clones of Muscat and Zinfandel. So it's kind of like going back in time. But this vineyard sits at about 2,000 feet in elevation, and it's very much, which is what I'm drinking, it's very much not your typical, off-dry Riesling. It's very much in the style of Alsace with a lot of oily petrol and grapefruit and silky texture, and has that I guess if you had a typical Napa Valley Riesling, this would be it. Lime zest, honeysuckle, grapefruit, and very much texture. So is anyone else drinking the Smith-Madrone Riesling tonight? If you are, you can either put it in the chat or.
Yeah, and actually we were at that wine dinner that you're talking about.
Oh, wow, how nice.
Yeah, because I was saying, oh, I've had this before, and I thought, did we go there? And then you said about the wine dinner, and I said, oh, that's where we met the guy and tasted several of these.
So he's quite the character. When we visited, like I highly recommend you go, when you go to Napa Valley, you do a day in these main appellations. So if you did a day in Spring Mountain, and they would be one of the main characters that you would see. And you can do, Stony Hill that same day. You can do Philip Tony, which is a winery not far from there. But it's incredible, these guys. Like they're, probably now maybe in their, I guess you can call it early 60s, like I would imagine. But and their son is running, Stuart's son is also helping in the winery and the vineyards. But this winery was named after these big trees. They're called the Madrone, and they're like these big redwood trees, and they're still really, the soil in that area is like this old volcanic ash, and you just see this beautiful view of the prime part of Napa Valley, but you're in this mountain, very green type environment. So I think it's one of the reasons I picked it. And then for the red, if you or any of you are drinking the red, we wouldn't be talking about the history of Napa Valley without referencing Chateau Montelena. And Montelena, of course, is known for winning the Judgment of Paris, which we'll talk about in 1976 for their Chardonnay, which is quite lovely. But really, the Zinfandel is a hidden gem in their portfolio. The first time I tried it was at the winery. So Chateau Montelena, located on Tubbs Lane, and it's in Calistoga, and it's a property that has a lot of history. It was founded by a gentleman named Alfred Tubbs. It was about 250 acres, and he bought this property after the gold rush and made a lot of money in the gold rush. And in the early 1900s or late 1800s, it was the 7th largest winery in Napa Valley. So it hasn't had a lot of owners. It's had maybe 5 owners since the late 1800s, and was almost sold to an investing, like a large international winery. But then the deal didn't go through, and Jim and Bo Barrett are the current owners. So they've owned this winery since 1968. For me, the Zin is, it's like California Zinfandel meets Cabernet. It's got a lot of like well-developed like tannins, and it's firm and dusty. The typical nose is blueberry and fig and cocoa. But of course, me, I love my Zinfandel, and I love Zinfandel that ages. And I have drank a lot of Chateau Montelena with age, and it's really, really beautiful. So now we get to talk about the history, and we're really going to spend a significant amount of time talking about the history of Napa Valley. And really it starts in 1770s as Vitis vinifera arrives from Spain, and it was via Mexico that the grapes and the vines came throughout what is now California. So it was under Spanish control, and until the Mexican War of Independence, Mexico and what is now Western United States was part of what they called the New Spain. So these monarchs sent these Spanish missionaries to develop new populations of Catholics. And basically, with the missions, they established religion and formal viticulture. So we saw this grape at the time, which was called Palomino. It's the sherry grape, for those of you that are familiar. And this is a red version, Palomino Negro, which is also known as Listan Prieto in the Canary Islands. So this grape makes its way with the Spanish missionaries and all through Mexico to what is now California. In 1821, Mexico gains independence from Spain, and the missions are secularized, and they shift from making growing grapes for religion to shifting to agriculture. So the northernmost mission at the time, which was part of Sonoma, was about 700 square miles and included all of Napa Valley. And at that time, there was a Mexican general named Vallejo, and he was sent to disperse the mission's holdings. So these, vineyards that were owned or the land grants that were given was meant to break up the mission's holdings of land. So General Vallejo awards one of the first land grants to a general that worked for him, a former employee named George Calvert Yount. And George Calvert Yount became one of the first American settlers to plant vines in the valley in 1838. So, at that time, of course, now we know of the town of Yountville, which is named after George Yount, but that was a really important settler in the Napa Valley. So in the 1860s and 1900s, we see gold discovered in California. In 1846 to 1848, we have the Mexican-American War, and California is ceded along with Texas and New Mexico to the United States. And that's when the Napa Valley wine industry really begins to take hold, and that's about 1850. In the mid 1850s, there's over 50,000 different grapevines and roughly 200,000 by 1859. So we're talking about a couple of different characters. There's a gentleman named J.W. Osborne in 1851. He's from Massachusetts, and he brings with him a lot of international grapes, including Zinfandels and some muscats. He founded something called the Sonoma Napa Horticultural Society, along with a gentleman named Agustin Herazli, who went to found Buena Vista. And Agustin Herazli is credited with being the father of California viticulture, basically. He founded Buena Vista, and he took a lot of trips back and forth to Europe and brought with him suitcase cuttings of a lot of different vines that would then go on and become the vines that UC Davis had, and became the first vineyards of these noble grapes. So at a couple of other characters that were really important in 1861, we have Charles Krug. He's a German immigrant who founded the first commercial winery in St. Helena. We also have Jacob Stromsberg, who founded Stromsberg, which is one of the most beautiful sparkling wine cellars. And it was really innovative at the time to not only found a wine cellar with a dedication to sparkling wine, but to build the caves similar to that of Champagne, and further to start a winery in the mountains. So that was one of the first wineries to be founded in the mountains, and it was on Diamond Mountain. We see Thomas Rutherford at that time also founded his vineyard, and H.W. Crabb, which was the founder of a vineyard, which is the most famous vineyard in the Napa Valley, called Tokelon. And there's others, of course. There's John Benson, who founded Farniente, and Alfred Tubbs, which was at that time starting construction in what is now Chateau Montelena in Calistoga, which is, of course, how we get the name of Tubbs Lane, named after Alfred Tubbs. And there's also another gentleman named J.H. Fisher, who in 1889 founded what would become the winery Maniec. So really just at that time, there was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. It brought a lot of people from the East, and we started to see Napa Valley really come into its own. We have Jacob Berenger and his brother, Frederick, that start Berenger. And of course, at the later part, we have Gustav Niebaum, who purchased and started the winery Inglenook. So in the 1880s, there's over 140 vineyards in Napa Valley. And so it was a really thriving market for fine wine, and all of these amazing people started wineries. And then, of course, we have the 1920s, and from 1920 to 1933, Prohibition. And that was total devastation, except for shipping grapes for home consumption. Pretty much this thriving industry stopped, and it really was only a few people such as BV and Beringer, that continued to make wine for religious purposes. So there was a provision in the law that allowed, 200 gallons of fruit juice a year, and they started using shipper varietals like grapes that would be good for transport, and they were just inferior grapes, grapes that wouldn't spoil on the railroad. And in 1926, and the height of the middle of Prohibition, the grapes that were planted were grapes that pretty much now you would consider as blending grapes: Alicante Pouchet, 40%, Petit Syrah for color, and these shipper varietals, with the exception of Zinfandel, were just really made into fortified wine, port style wines, and really just not for fine wine production. And then we have a gentleman named George de la Tour, and he founded the vineyards BV, or Below Vineyards, in 1904. And what he did was he hired a Russian viticulturist and consulting winemaker named Andrei Chelychev, and he became probably the most celebrated consultant to the Napa Valley. And after Prohibition, we see the reopening of Inglenook and Beringer and the introduction of the winery Larkmead. And at that time, we have Louis Martini. They moved their winery to St. Helena. And we have the Mondavi family, who purchased the winery called the Sunny St. Helena Winery in 1937. So again, the 40s, pretty much, between World War II, Prohibition, the Great Depression, we start to see, well, actually World War II was pretty much good for the Napa Valley, because we helped revive domestic wine consumption with the war. In Europe, we pretty much started drinking more domestic wine, and the annual per capita wine consumption was topped 1 gallon for the first time after World War II. And so at that time, Mondavi purchases Charles Krug, Trinchero purchases Sutter Home, and in 1960s, there's 10,000 acres, and most of it is table wine, fortified wine, and only 6% is the grapes that we know and love today: Chardonnay, Cabernet. And then came Robert Mondavi in the late 1966. So Robert Mondavi was working for the winery Charles Krug, and decided to split from the family and build his own namesake winery and create his own brand. But more importantly, Robert Mondavi founded tourism and helped build a wine culture of, it's not just agriculture, but it's really about making helping open restaurants and making it a wine country. And that was probably one of the biggest reasons that we started to see an increase in wineries opening and tourism. At that time, you start to see some of the names of one of my favorites, Chateau, which is on Pritchard Hill. While we had our, welcome to Napa Valley reception. My other favorite opens at that time, Diamond Creek, which I think is the best Napa Valley cab for aging. They have a number of different single vineyards that I've had the great pleasure of trying back to the 70s. Diamond Creek, gravelly meadow, a lot of people think tastes like Cheval Blanc. And then we have the winery Spring Mountain also opening at that time. In 1970s, the newcomers, these guys, Diamond Creek, Clos de Val, Silver Oak, Caymus, Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, it's just starting to become more popular for people to plant Chardonnay and Cabernet. And so what happens at that time is Stephen Spurrier selects some of the best Chardonnays and Cabernets from these newcomers, and decides that he's going to, with the bicentennial celebration of the United States, he's going to have a blind wine tasting competition. And he hires or he gets the best judges from France, and he puts on this competition where The French wines like, you know, at the time, one of the judges was Aubert de Villaine, and you have the Montrachet wines and a number of other great, Bordeaux wines pitted against California. And to everybody's surprise, California wins the top two places with 1973 vintage of Chardonnay from Chateau Montelena and 73 from Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, placing in the first place. And the interesting thing is it was like a small competition, and it probably wouldn't have been as celebrated, and it wouldn't have changed the face of Napa Valley except for George Tabor. He wrote a magazine article at the time for Time magazine, and it came out in June of 1976, and 20 million people read the article. And that's when international investment and a lot of other people started noticing the Napa Valley. And that's when the floodgates opened. In 1978 through the early 80s, 46 new wineries opened, including the likes of Opus One, which was the most, I guess, celebrated joint venture, with Robert Mondavi and Baron Philippe Rothschild. And it was following the elevation of Chateau Mouton Rothschild to first growth from second growth that Opus One was started. And then a lot of other famous joint ventures between French families and Americans started after that. But that was until 1981. And then simultaneously, what was really important for the American wine population was the Robert Parker's Wine Advocate and Wine Spectator. Both were founded around that time. So in the 70s and 80s, we have Robert Parker starting his magazine and Wine Spectator, and the middle class Americans start to feel for the first time that there's someone writing for them, and the thirst for wine increases. But most popular, probably the reason that it really became popular, was it was easy to understand for the first time a point scale, which was Robert Parker's. He started that where he made it easy for people to understand quality wine on this point scale, and really made Napa Valley a household name. It was equated to quality and luxury. And right around that same time, the Napa Valley wine auction is started. And that auction in 1981 was the first year. And it basically became this shift between agriculture and a playground for the wealthy. So you start to see what was farmland and unknown, and bulk wine becoming a luxury product. And it really started increasing again, and the floodgates were open. And in 1986 we started 1983 we had a lot of development. Vineyard lands tripled, but the problem at that time was a lot of the new plantings were on this type of clone called AXR1. And we thought that AXR1 was resistant to phylloxera, but in fact, we started to see phylloxera come back. And the old vines at the time, St. George rootstocks were fine, but all of this new growth of this, influx of wineries planting on this, what was thought to be resistant rootstock, starts to all spread phylloxera again. And then there was a flood in 1986 in Napa Valley, which made roughly 13,000 vineyards, or acres rather, go underwater. And I think what a lot of people say is that phylloxera coming back and this flooding actually was probably one of the best things for the valley at that time, because with this devastation, people started replanting, and this time they started replanting the right grapes and the right places. And there was a growth of now knowledge of what would go best in the Napa Valley. So we started to have a lot of consulting winemakers and vineyards like David Abreu that advise people how to use VSP and vertical shoot positioning to basically replant the valley in the right way. So 1980s, this was probably one of the best decades for Napa Valley. It was steady, it was sunny. There were some of the best vintages that were worshipped by the press. This was when you know, the economy was doing great. People were buying wine, and one of the best Napa Valley wine auctions was 2000 vintage, where a single 6-liter bottle of Screaming Eagle sold for $500,000. And really that became, again, this sign that Napa Valley was for, you know, luxury collectors. And in 1997, this is all in the mid 90s, we have Napa Valley wine auction. Or sorry, the wine auction, it was in 2000, but in 1997, the vintage of the century by Wine Spectator, and 2000, 2004, also fantastic vintages, but hot. And we start to see higher levels of alcohol. The end of the 90s and the early 2000s, we went away from the 70s and 80s having lower alcohols at 13.5 and started to see, you know, 15, 16% alcohol. A lot of people say it's because of Robert Parker's palate being more geared towards bigger is better, that these higher Brix levels start to happen. And then it all came crashing down again. In 2008, we had the housing market crisis, the economic crisis, a worldwide downturn in the stock market, and really, you know, this luxury wine market and these kind of cold cabs that were released for, you know, thousands of dollars, it stopped. And there's also a widespread change in wine criticism. So Robert Parker ends up retiring from reviewing Napa Valley, and Antonio Galloni leaves and starts his own wine magazine, and the media changes voices. And now, up until even now, it becomes more about blogs and sommeliers, and we're returning to a more balanced and perhaps older school style of wines being made in Napa Valley. So there was a push towards lighter style, lower alcohol wines at the end of 2010 through 2020. And so some of the international grapes, some of those like immigrants grapes that were brought in before the gold rush, they're becoming more fashionable again as we look to the future for Napa Valley. Are there any comments or thoughts on the history so far? I think the vintage for the Chateau Montelena that we sent, I believe, was 2019, and I think it was on the back label, but I don't know, maybe it got torn away from yours, and it should be there though. That's I believe what we sent.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. So anyway, just a quick review of the AVA system. As you probably are well aware, the American Viticultural Area is how we name quality wine in the US. And while we don't control what grapes can be planted in what appellations, we do have you know, a label integrity system where if you state an AVA or a subregion, 85% must come from that AVA. And if you're putting a vintage on the label, the 95 must come from the vintage. Oddly enough, which is sometimes critiqued in the US, if you name a grape on the label, the minimum requirement by law is only 75% from that stated varietal. So it's sometimes why we see, you know, maybe Pinot Noir that's like dark and inky purple in color. being allowed to blend up to 25% of another grape varietal. And furthermore, we have larger AVAs that can be divided into smaller AVAs. So in Napa Valley, you might see first, if you're using the larger appellation, the North Coast, and then you have Napa, and then within Napa, you can have sub AVAs like Rutherford, and then individual vineyards. So that's our quick guide for the quality system. And now for Napa Valley overview. The valley is about 40 miles long and roughly 5 miles wide at its widest near Calistoga, and about 1 mile 1 mile wide at its smallest. It's about the eighth the size of Bordeaux, and it's only 4% of the total of California vineyards, but it makes up 25% of revenue. So currently there are roughly 470 wineries that make over 1,000 brands. You're probably familiar, but it's because it's surrounded by two mountain ranges. You have the Maniec mountain range and the Vaca mountain range. So you have the warmer Central Valley on the eastern side of the Vaca Mountains, and you have Sonoma on the opposite side of the Maniec Mountains. So if you're driving north in Napa Valley and you're on Highway 29, you'll probably note that the Vaca Mountains look really, really dry and almost like just baked by the sun. And if you look at, your driver's side on your left, if you're driving north, you'll see the Maniec mountain ranges are quite green. And to believe it or not, both receive the same amount of rainfall each year. But you have the Maniec mountain range that is in the west that receives a lot of the morning sun. And so the afternoon sun, the warmest part of the sun, sets behind the peaks, and you don't get that sun scorching the same way you do in the Vaca Mountains, which receive all the afternoon sun and therefore are really just kind of dry. And in the middle of the valley is the most fertile. So that's where the heat stays and you have a lot of warmth. And as you go up in elevation, sometimes you can have the difference in diurnal temperature shift of 30 degrees between the valley floor and the mountains. We call this area dry Mediterranean climate, but there are some cooler pockets of Napa Valley. So right here in the San Pablo Bay, you have a cooling breeze that comes via the Petaluma Gap and brings cooling air from San Francisco Bay through San Pablo Bay up the valley. And so as you are in the southern part near Carneros, you'll have cooler temperatures, sometimes up to 20 degrees warmer in Calistoga. And as you go up, of course, the warm air is funneled through the valley. There are a couple of exceptions in this mountain range, in the Maniec mountain range, where you have these gaps and cool air is allowed to get through these gaps. Specifically, when you're talking about Diamond Mountain, you have like little peaks where cracks get through and you have cooling breezes. The indigenous inhabitants of this area called named Napa Valley because it means land of plenty. So it was there that it got its name. And really it's the extreme temperatures are because we have pretty much no rain in the summer, and we do get a lot of drought as a result of that, and wildfires as a result of the drought. 3 different soil types. They range from rocky and volcanic to alluvial soils that travel by the river, and gravel and loam and clay. And of course, we'll go through them in a minute, but we have 16 sub-AVAs of Napa Valley. Just to become a little bit more familiar, we have Childs Valley District over here, just north, some of the newer appellations. We have, Coombsville over here, and we have Oak Knoll district, and we'll go through them individually in just a minute. The Calistoga, Diamond Mountain, Spring Mountain, and then if you're looking at the city of Napa, you have a Stag's Leap district over here, downtown Napa, Carneros just south, of course Mount Veeder here, Spring Mountain, Diamond Mountain, and you have Atlas Peak over here. And there are 16 sub or nested appellations, including those that we mentioned. Really just each of those regions has a specific and characteristic that makes it unique. And let's see. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about three main soil types of Napa Valley. There are three main ones. There's one called the Great Valley, one called the Franciscan Melange, and a third which is Napa Volcanic. And the Great Valley is mostly runoff from the Sierra Nevadas. It's sand and clay, and it was formed about 80 million years ago. And the Franciscan Melange was formed about 4 million years ago. And Napa Volcanic most recently about 2 million years ago. And Franciscan formed as a result of the offshore Farallon plates shifting and sliding beneath the North American plate. And so it's this fault line of the San Andreas Fault, which formed the uplift of these coastal mountains and actually formed the volcanic soils in the mountains. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Carneros. Carneros is the most southern of the AVAs in Napa Valley. It's cool because of the San Pablo Bay, and its rolling hills are, they were named as a reference to the history of raising livestock, and there's lots of sheep there. It technically can be labeled as Sonoma, as Napa, and as Sonoma Coast. Really famous for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and specifically really great sparkling wines. You'll see some international investments with Tattinger making Domaine Carneros, and Moet and Chandon forming Domaine Chandon. Andrei Chelychev named this area the Burgundy of Napa Valley. So some of the wineries you might find there, Etude, Dunham Estates. There's some great single vineyards owned by Hyde and Hudson, and you see a lot of people using this AVA for the production of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And then we're going to go to Mount Veeder. Just looking at Mount Veeder, it's called the Mountain by the Bay. It's the coolest of all the mountain ranges and the most rugged. It's not far from the San Pablo Bay, so the southern part of this mountain range, and it's Napa's longest growing season and its lowest yield. So you'll see really expensive farming in Mount Veeder. It's mandated, well, it's not mandated, but it's common to do hand harvesting because of the rugged terrain and all these very steep slopes. And it's incredibly different than the rest of Napa Valley. It's where you find the winery Maniec, and which has some of the highest vineyards at about 2,400 feet. And you see a lot of volcanic and sandy soils, shale, and it's the least developed. So it still looks really rugged. You can see mostly trees, even though it's a large appellation at 17,000 acres. It's a really only small amount of plantings, about 1,100. So Maniec, they're probably the most famous, along with Laglier Meredith, make some great Zinfandels, as well as Syrah, and Chardonnay, of course, is also really popular and delicious from Maniec. Next appellation to become familiar with is Stag's Leap. This is what they call a velvet fist of Cabernet power, but a lot of finesse. And this is on the eastern portion of the Napa Valley. It's because of the landslides from the Vaca Mountains that created these benches or these knolls. And you have this towering stag's leap palisades to the east, which basically reflects sun onto the vineyards. And the temperatures rise quicker than in the other areas. And at night, you have this gap from the mountains that allow this cool air from San Pablo Bay through the Stag's Leap District corridor. And so the main soils volcanic from the eastern side and a mix of clay and loam in the lower part of the benchland. You have the southern area with this alluvial fan of Vaca range, and that's split with the two single vineyards. So you probably have heard of Bay and SLV, which were single vineyards made by Stag's Leap Wine Cellar. And 1961, we have Nathan Fay, who planted the first post-prohibition Cabernet vineyards, and Warren Winarski, the most celebrated from Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, because at the time they won the Judgment of Paris with their 73 vintage, and very, household name, of course, because of that Judgment of Paris. Yountville, it's of course named after the George Yount, who planted the first commercial vineyard in 1836. And you have this marine air that gets trapped from Yountville, and it is keeping the area cool, even though it's quite warm in the surrounding areas. And really, this is the food and wine haven. If you're visiting Napa Valley, you'll see the French Laundry, Ad Hoc, Bouchon. It's a great town to stay in if you're visiting and go and eat and drink. You have some small tasting rooms as well, but it's a great place to post up in the middle of the valley. Next, we're on to Oakville, rather, and Oakville is perhaps the heart of the actual Napa Valley sub-AVAs on the valley floor. In the morning, you have fog. It's cool, and then becomes warm and dry as the afternoon sun. It's perfect prime Cabernet land. They're talking like perhaps dividing Oakville into this east and west subregion, but this is some of the most important and celebrated wineries, both in Old Napa and New Napa, with Tokelon Vineyard located in Oakville, and of course with pioneers like Robert Mondavi, with it being Opus One and Joseph Heights in that area. And then, of course, one of my favorites, if you're ever visiting, you must go to Rudd, which is a winery located in the heart of Oakville, owned by Leslie and now Samantha Rudd, one of the most special vineyards and wineries you can visit. And they are the same owners of the restaurant Press, the Rudd family. So it's a great place to visit. And then just a little more history on Tokelon. It was planted by H.W. Crabb in 1868. And they sold, Martin Stelling sold part of this famous vineyard to BV. And that famous vineyard is probably the most expensive and sought after fruit, which is known as Beckstoffer Tokelon. And 1962, the heirs of Martin Stelling sold part of the vineyard to Charles Krug. And in 1965, Robert Mondavi purchased the remaining 12 acres. So when you go, that is a nice vineyard to go and look at. Next, we're on to Rutherford. Rutherford is often called, it's often referred to as very dusty. This is the heart of Cabernet territory as well. And Andrei Chelychov referenced the soils as that dust and having a really strong sense of like ashy tannin. The center of Napa Valley, of course, it's the fertile place. There's only about 600 feet in elevation, and you have this divide of the hillsides and the flatlands, named after Thomas Rutherford, who married George Yount's granddaughter. And this is home to, again, these old Napa Valley names, Inglenook, BV Vineyards, and some newcomers like Long Meadow Ranch and Quintessa and Staglin, which is one of the major landholders, along with Beckstoffer. Let's see, are there any questions so far? I don't see any in the chat. Okay, great. Moving along, we're on to St. Helena. Definitely a favorite place of mine. Another valley floor appellation, so going north, right here in St. Helena. This is just north of Rutherford and south of Calistoga. And it's one of my favorite people in the wine industry, which is this woman, Kathy Corson, where she has her vineyard called Kronos, and along with Berenger and Charles Krug in St. Helena, you find really powerful cab that are also very elegant. And I think Kathy Corson probably is the best example of power and knowledge. She was one of the first females to be at the best wineries in Napa as a winemaker. People told her like women shouldn't even be making wine when she first started. And she moved to Napa, and now she owns one of the best single vineyards in Napa Valley. So definitely go check out Corson and her Kronos vineyard if you're in St. Helena. That we go to Howell Mountain, and Howell Mountain was the first sub-appellation of the Napa Valley to receive its own AVA. These are the high altitude west-facing vineyards within the Vaca mountain range. And really the most important part about Howell Mountain is it's marked by the upper level of the inversion or the fog line. The daytime temperatures are much cooler than the valley floor. However, there's less temperature shifts. So it's like an elevated plateau more than a mountain. It gets about twice as much rainfall as the valley, and the rocky soils allow for drainage. So some of the best Cabernet and Zinfandel. You have Randy Dunn, of course, really beautiful. I know, Mayang, you've drank some Dunn vineyards with us that were really good, and Donna Estate in Howell Mountain as well. And then we're back to Spring Mountain, kind of where we started. The western side, just above Calistoga on the eastern slopes of the Maniec. We have these huge elevation, 2,600 feet, where Smith-Madrone is. And they receive the morning sun, but then they have these little breaks in the mountain ranges where you get these Pacific winds that come over the mountain in the afternoon. So we have cooler days and warmer nights, believe it or not, even though normally mountains have, cooler nights. This is an exception than on the valley floor. And so we have a lot of really beautiful Chardonnay, Cabernet, and one of my favorite vineyards besides Smith-Madrone to visit is Cane Vineyards. They had a little bit of damage with the most recent fires, but Cane is an incredible place in Spring Mountain to visit, along with Pride. And then last but not least, as we're talking about mountain appellations on the Maniec side, we go north to Diamond Mountain. It's again really rugged, only a handful of growers up there, and it has a little bit more hillsides, but it's not an actual mountain, and the peaks are low enough that you do get influence from the fog. So Napa's first hillside vineyard, as I mentioned earlier, was Jacob Schramm's, planting what's now known as Schramsberg, and Diamond Creek, perhaps my favorite of all Napa Valley cabs, especially with age. We're the first winery to sell Cabernet for $100 on release. They have a number of different single plots, like Volcanic Hill, Red Rock Terrace, Gravelly Meadow. So their Lake Vineyard is the smallest of all of their Diamond Creek's wines, but I really recommend trying to find some old Diamond Creek wines. And you'll be in a blind tasting, swear you'll drink Haut-Brion or Cheval Blanc, because they're just really delicious and taste in the early 70s and 80s, they taste a lot like Bordeaux. Calistoga is my favorite to visit. It's the northernmost AVA in Napa. It definitely feels like you're going back in time and visiting. That's where I have a little family house and where we stayed during our wedding. That's where Chateau Montelena is, of course. It's a lot of Zinfandel planted there. There are these warm hot springs in the area, and so lots of volcanic soils. And you can see from Diamond Mountain and Howell Mountain, Calistoga. Another great vineyard to visit is Larkmead, which is not far. It's between Calistoga, but just south of Calistoga. And then last but not least, it's Pritchard Hill. This is unofficially on the Vaca Mountains between Atlas Peak and Howell Mountain. And it has this cooling influence from Lake Hennessy, named after Charles Pritchard, who established a vineyard there in the 1880s. And now this property is owned by the Chapelets and Blakesley Chapelet, and they have, a beautiful vineyard that was founded in the early 60s, in the mid 60s rather, and a great place to visit, along with Colgan and Continuum in this Pritchard Hill appellation. The Robert Mondavi family, Carissa Mondavi and her dad founded the winery Continuum, and along with Brian family being there. So a note on vintages, definitely check out Kelly White's book because she has vintages dating back to the 40s in her book. But the previous notion, of course, that California is the same is not really true anymore. We have a more focus on terroir and sustainability and less about getting bricks to be so high and ripe and big flavor. So it's kind of impossible to generalize because there's so much diversity in mountain ranges and valley floor. It's really important to think about the different grapes and the appellations, but it's good when you get to know winemaking styles, knowing vintages. So we start with 14. It was definitely a year of severe drought, but right now it's one of my favorites to drink. In 2013 was also a year of a drought, very warm and dry, really early harvest. Unfortunately, a lot of the 2013s the following year were destroyed by the earthquake. So you don't really see that much of the 13s because a lot of people had their 13s in barrel during the earthquake, and so there was a lot lost. But 2012 was very classic, warm but not hot. So I think if you're into a little bit of a underripe or slightly less pronounced alcohol, 2012 is a great vintage. And same with 11 and 10. 11 and 10 were oddly very cold. So for me, those are great vintages if you want to drink right now. They're more sommelier vintages, cold weather, very non-typical for Napa Valley. And with that would conclude our class. Does anybody have any questions, thoughts, comments? Good to see everybody.
Hey, Laura, I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned about how great older Napa Valley Cabernets are. So let's say that I had the opportunity to have a 15-year-old Pauillac and a 15-year-old Napa Valley Cabernet. What would I expect to be the difference? Would it still be a kind of a stronger fruit in the 15-year-old Napa Valley versus the Pauillac, or how would you contrast them?
Yeah, for sure, Edgar. So I think first, Napa Valley in 15 years of age is still generally considered young. And I feel like, at our wedding, we had some, late 70s, early 80s. And those were when you really started to see the secondary and tertiary fruits. I did a vertical tasting at Cork Buzz for the Chapelets, like where they hosted, and they showed vintages dating back to the first in 1967, and those were starting to show development. I feel like oddly, 15-year-old Pauillac is showing more development than 15-year-old Napa Cab. So Napa Cab, it's tricky because it's 15 years, it still smells very fruity and very intense, and you know, the oak is still showing you know, much more pronounced than in Bordeaux. So I would say definitely fruitier, more powerful, but also just younger. Even if you're comparing the exact same vintage, Napa tastes like a decade younger than it is usually. That's why it's so surprising to me that there's really no older Napa Valley cabs in restaurants, because you know, it only after, you know, 20 years or 15 too, but that you start to see how great Napa Valley cab can be, but none of us get to see it.
Well, let me change my question then. 30-year-old for each.
Oh, 30-year-old, you're definitely, they're not that dissimilar. Like, you're starting to see the leaner styles of Napa Valley. So the alcohols are not that high. And you're gonna find that sort of green herbal characteristic in Napa Valley cab showing. But you know, I mean, obviously there's still more fruits than Bordeaux, but they start to kind of have similarities at 30 years old for sure.
Okay.
Especially Pauillac, which is more powerful.
Right. Thank you.
All right. Any other, I think I hear my son crying, getting in the bath. Any other thoughts, comments, questions before we end our night? It's really good to see you guys. Thanks for welcoming me back for my first in-person, well, virtual class since the baby. So I look forward to seeing everybody in the restaurant soon. I'll be back in and around New York in November, so hopefully we'll get to have a glass of wine together and celebrate. So have a great night, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Laura. That was great. Thank you.
Bye. We'll follow up
Thank you so
tomorrow.
much. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.